Priscilla Breakwell held the invitation over the kitchen fire and waited until Juniper Hale looked up. That was the part that mattered. Not the burning, the watching. Priscilla could have fed the envelope to the flames an hour earlier, alone, and nobody in the house on Coldwater Row would have known the difference. Instead, she had carried it down 3 flights of stairs in her nightdress, past the cold larder, into the scullery where June was scrubbing the copper stockpot with a fistful of salt and river sand, and she had stood there with the cream-colored paper pinched between 2 fingers until June's shoulders registered her presence and June's chin came up. "There," Priscilla said. "Now you're paying attention." The seal on the envelope was black wax, stamped with a wolf's head inside a ring of iron thorns. June knew that marked the way everyone in the kingdom of Hallomere knew it, from coins and court notices and the tax stamps that arrived every autumn. She had never in her life seen it on something addressed to this house. "Priscilla." Her voice came out low. "What is that?" "A mistake," Priscilla said, and dropped it. The paper caught at the corner first. Flame ran up the edge in a thin blue line, then blackened inward, and the wax seal softened and slid, and dropped off the folded sheet like something dying. June was across the scullery before she had decided to move. She got her hand into the grate. She got 2 fingers on the corner that hadn't taken yet, and she pulled, and the heat went into her knuckles like a bite. And Priscilla laughed. Actually laughed, high and delighted, and said, "God, look at you." June came away with a scrap the size of her palm and a burn across the back of her hand that would blister by morning. She stood in the middle of the scullery floor breathing hard, her fist closed around the paper, salt and sand still gritted into her wet palm. "It was addressed to me," she said. "It was addressed to this household," Priscilla said. "Mother says the Chancery scribes have been sloppy for years. They pull names off the old tithe rolls. Half the county got one." She smoothed her nightdress down over her hips with the flat of both hands, a gesture she had been practicing in mirrors since she was 14. "Mother's already written to correct it. Winifred and I are on the confirmed list. You are not on any list, June, because you are not anything. You don't even smell." There it was. Priscilla always got there eventually. It was only ever a question of how long she could hold it in her mouth. "Go to bed," June said. "You'd have stood in that hall like a chair," Priscilla said on her way out. "Like a chair somebody left in a ballroom." The door swung. The house settled. June stayed where she was until the sound of Priscilla's feet had gone up past the second landing, and then she opened her hand. Hallomere had a law, and the law had a name, and the name was the Concord of Assay. It was 31 years old that autumn, which meant that everyone June's age had grown up inside it the way fish grow up inside water, without any particular sense that the world had ever been shaped otherwise. The Concord said that every wolf-born citizen of the kingdom was to be assayed at 16, scent-tested, blood-tested, ranked, and entered into the Chancery Registry under one of the 9 recognized classifications. It said that classification determined what work you could hold, what streets you could live on, what oaths you could swear, and, this was the part that made the whole machine turn, what your mating settlement was worth, because a settlement was money. That was the thing people outside Hallomere never understood. A classified omega of good line, entered clean in the registry, carried a settlement value that the great banking houses on the Thornberry exchange would lend against. They called the instruments consort bonds. A family could borrow against a daughter's future match the way a farmer borrows against a harvest, and the Chancery of Assay took its percentage on the issue, and the whole gleaming edifice of Thornberry's wealth rested on the simple, unquestioned premise that some wolves were worth more than others, and the Chancery could tell you exactly how much. June had been assayed at 16, like everyone. She had stood in a stone room in the assay house on Barrow Street, while a clerk in a gray coat held a strip of treated linen to her throat and waited, and held it there longer, and then went away and came back with a second clerk. And the second clerk had made her hold her arms out and had leaned in close to the crook of her elbow and inhaled, twice, and then straightened up with an expression June still remembered 5 years later. Not cruelty. Something worse. A kind of professional embarrassment, as though she had turned out to be a clerical error that had learned to walk around. Null Presentation, the certificate said. No detectable classification. Registry status. Withheld. Scentless. In a kingdom where a wolf's scent was their name, their rank, their marriage contract, and their credit rating all at once, June Hale gave off nothing at all. She had spent 5 years being the girl who stood in doorways at the edge of gatherings while everyone else read each other like open ledgers. Unclassed meant unmarriageable. Unmarriageable meant worthless as collateral. Worthless as collateral meant that when her father died and left the house on Coldwater Row to his second wife and the debts to whoever wanted them, there had been no argument at all about what June was for. She was for the stockpot, the stairs, the laundry coppers, the cold larder in February. She flattened the scrap against her apron and turned it toward the firelight. Most of it was gone. The salutation, the body, the date. What survived was the lower left corner and about 2 inches of the fold. There was a fragment of a line in the Chancery's stiff upright hand. Juniper Hale, of Coldwater Row, Thornberry Reach, and beneath it, a second fragment. And it was the second fragment that made June sit down slowly on the scullery step, with her burned hand curled in her lap. Because an invitation says the honor of your presence. This one said, compelled to appear before the assay of the crown, and failure to answer this writ shall be held. And beneath that, half eaten by the char, not the wolf's head in thorns at all, but a second impression pressed into the paper itself. Blind, without ink. 3 interlocking rings and a bar. June had seen that mark exactly once before in her life, and she had been 11 years old, and it had been on the underside of the lid of a cedar box her mother kept beneath the hearthstone in the upstairs room. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. Noreen Hale had not been from Thornberry. That was the first thing anyone said about her, and usually the last. She had come down out of the Grey March, the wild country north of the border, where the free packs still ran, and no chancery clerk had ever successfully counted anything. And she had married a land surveyor named Tobias Hale, who was so ordinary that the marriage had been discussed in the town for a decade. She had worn her hair in a single plait. She had kept field journals in a hand so small it needed a lens. And she had taught her daughter 3 things that June still carried. How to walk on frost without cracking it. How to tell a wolf's individual voice out of a chorus of them the way you'd pick a friend's laugh out of a crowded room. And a melody. The melody had no words. It went low, then dropped lower, then climbed in an odd interval that felt wrong on a human throat, and it ended unresolved, hanging. Noreen had called it the threshold song, and had never once explained it. And June had hummed it under her breath while scrubbing floors for 11 years, without ever thinking to ask why a song should feel like a question left open on purpose. Fever took Noreen in the winter of June's 10th year. That was the story. Fever, quickly, and a closed coffin because of the contagion, and Tobias Hale remarried within 14 months to a widow named Cordelia Breakwell, who arrived with 2 daughters, a great deal of well-cut mourning black, and a brother. The brother was the reason June had learned to be quiet. Lord Halvard Breakwell was Chancellor of the Assay. He had held the office for 19 years. He was a tall, dry, courteous man who never raised his voice, and who had once, when June was 13, and had spilled tea across a set of chancery ledgers spread on the dining table, gone down on one knee to help her mop it up and said, gently, without any heat whatsoever, "You are a very careful girl, Juniper. Stay that way." Careless people end up in files. He came to Coldwater Row 4 times a year. He always asked after June's health. He always looked at her a beat longer than was comfortable, the way a man checks a fence line. And every night since June could remember, Cordelia had brought her a cup of tea before bed. It was a household ritual so old it had stopped being visible. chamomile and something bitter under it that Cordelia said was valerian for the nerves, because June had been such a nervous child after her mother, hadn't she? And it steadied her. Cordelia brought it in the same chipped blue cup. Cordelia waited while she drank it. On the 2 or 3 occasions in 11 years when June had tried to set it aside, Cordelia had not argued or scolded. She had simply sat down on the edge of the bed and waited, patient as weather, until June drank. June had never once wondered about it. She sat on the scullery step in the dark with the scrap of the writ in her fist, and for the first time in her life, wondered about it. The house had a hearthstone in the upstairs room that had been June's mother's, and was now a linen store. June went up at 11:30 with a candle, and no plan. The stone came up easier than it should have. Someone had lifted it before. The mortar seam was clean, the dust wrong. Underneath was a hollow the size of a bread oven, and in the hollow was nothing at all except the pale rectangle in the grime where something square had sat for a long time and then been taken away. June knelt there with the candle guttering and understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and left her cold, that she was not the only person in this house who knew what was under this floor. Downstairs, the long case clock in the hall began to strike 12. She counted it without meaning to. 8, 9, 10. On 11, the dogs at the Follett farm across the field started up, all 4 of them at once, in the particular register dogs use for something they cannot see. On 12, someone knocked on the front door of the house on Coldwater Row. Nobody knocked at midnight. Nobody knocked at all. Coldwater Row was 3 miles out from Thornberry proper, past the beet fields, and callers came in daylight and came by the kitchen. June was on the stairs with the candle when the second knock came, and it was not louder than the first, which somehow made it worse. Cordelia's door opened. Cordelia came out onto the landing in a gray wrapper with her hair down, and June saw her stepmother's face in the candlelight before Cordelia had composed it, and the expression on it was not confusion. It was dread, old, specific, and rehearsed. The face of a woman who had been waiting 11 years for a particular knock and had begun lately to hope. "Go to your room," Cordelia said. "Who is it?" "June." It came out cracked. "Go to your room and shut the door and do not—" The third knock. And a voice through the wood, unhurried, pitched to carry no further than the doorstep. "Open it, Lady Breakwell. I have a warrant, and I would rather not use it on a door." Priscilla was on the upper landing now with Winifred behind her, and Winifred, 17, plain-faced, the one who never spoke at meals, had both hands pressed over her mouth. Cordelia went down the stairs the way people walk to a scaffold. She drew the bolt. She opened the door. There were 3 men on the step, and a 4th further back holding the heads of 5 horses that were steaming in the cold. 2 of them wore the slate-gray coats of crown wardens. 1 wore no coat of office at all, only a traveling cloak the color of wet charcoal, and he was tall in the way certain wolves were tall, which had very little to do with height, and everything to do with the way the air rearranged itself to make room. June knew him before she saw the thorn-ringed wolf's head worked in dark thread over his heart. Everyone in Hallomere knew what he looked like. Descriptions traveled village to village the way important things do. Ivor Kestrel, Alpha King of Hallomere, sovereign of the 9 classifications and the concord that made them. He did not look at Cordelia. He did not look at Priscilla, who had come 3 steps down the staircase and arranged herself against the banister with an instinct so fast it was almost admirable. He looked past all of them, up the stairs, into the dark of the second landing where June was standing with a candle in one hand and a scrap of burned paper in the other, and something in his face changed. Not softened, June thought later, but steadied, the way a man's face steadies when a long arithmetic finally balances. "Juniper Hale," he said. "Your Majesty," Cordelia said quickly. "She is not classified. She is not registered. She cannot lawfully be presented at any assay. There has been an error in the Chancery rolls. My brother himself has—" Lady Breakwell, still not looking at her. Be quiet. June came down 4 steps. She was aware of the burn on her hand, of the grit still under her nails, of the fact that she was wearing a work dress with the cuffs rolled and no shoes. The writ came here, Ivor Kestrel said. It was signed by my own hand 9 days ago and entered on the roll. Service was recorded this afternoon at 4 o'clock. He glanced, once, at the black smear of ash on June's fingers. The assay of the crown was called for 9 tonight. You were required to be standing in the long hall at 9 tonight, Miss Hale, and the entire proceeding has been suspended for 3 hours because you were not. I never saw it, June said. Her voice sounded very small in the hall. Until an hour ago. It was already burning. Behind her, on the staircase, Priscilla Breakwell made a sound. The king's eyes moved to the paper in June's fist, and then, unhurried, up the stairs to Priscilla, and then back. I see, he said. I don't understand, June said. I'm nobody. I'm not on any roll. Why would the crown compel? Because 31 years ago, a woman named Noreen set her hand and her seal to the 4th page of the Concord of Assay, said the Alpha King of Hallomere, and every law in this kingdom stands on that page, and she has been dead for 11 years, Miss Hale, which means the only living voice that can speak to what is written there belongs to her daughter. The candle shook. Wax ran down over June's knuckles, and she did not feel it. My mother, she said, kept field journals about wolves. Your mother, he said, was the warden of the Wild Registry, and I have spent 4 years trying to prove she was murdered. They gave her 9 minutes to dress, and one of the wardens carried her boots. June rode the 3 miles into Thornberry Reach behind a warden named Bram O'Duya, on a horse the size of a barn door, with her burned hand wrapped in a strip of somebody's clean shirt and the scrap of the writ folded into a square inside her bodice because she did not trust it to a pocket. Behind them came a second horse with Cordelia on it, sitting very straight, saying nothing. Behind that, a hired trap with Priscilla and Winifred, and a warden riding at the wheel, because destroying a crown writ under service was a crime with a name, interruption of process, and the wardens had taken the entire household into what O'Duya called, with great delicacy, the king's convenience. Thornberry at 1 a.m. was not asleep. That was the first thing that struck her. The Exchange District was blazing. Every window on Corn Street was lit, and there were clerks in the road, actual clerks, in shirt sleeves in the cold, running paper between counting houses like men fighting a fire. What's happened? June asked. O'Duya answered without turning his head. You have. I don't understand. The assay of the crown was called 9 days ago, he said. The instant that writ went on the roll, every bond house on the exchange knew the Concord was going to be examined in open court. Consort bonds opened this morning at 91. They closed at 63. He let the horse pick its way around a knot of men arguing under a lamp. There is about 4 million crowns worth of paper in this city that is only worth anything as long as nobody looks too hard at page 4. And tonight, the king put a torch to the room. I only found out I existed 2 hours ago. Yes, O'Duya said. That's rather the point of view, miss. She had never been inside the Hallomere Keep. She had seen the outer wall from the Thornberry Road on market days, the way you see a mountain, as a fact of the landscape with no possible relation to yourself. Inside, the corridor smelled of cold stone and lamp oil and, underneath it, of wolves. Hundreds of them. Generations of them. Worked into the plaster the way wood smoke works into a coat. 2 factors from the bond house of Ainsworth and Peel passed her on the stair, arguing in low voices. And one of them said, if the 4th page is bad, then the whole ratification is bad, and the other said don't say that on a staircase, and neither of them looked at the barefoot girl in the work apron at all, which June found obscurely comforting. It was the last hour of her life in which anyone in that building would fail to look at her. The long hall of Hallomere was a stone room 140 feet long, with a vaulted roof and no throne in it, which surprised her. There was a table. It ran nearly the whole length, and around it, at 1 a.m, sat perhaps 40 people in various states of exhausted formality. Bond house factors, chancery clerks, 2 bishops of the ninefold, a woman in a gray academic hood, and at the far end, alone, with a stack of ledgers squared in front of him, and his hands folded on top of them, Lord Halvard Breakwell. He rose when June came in. He was the only one who did. "Juniper," he said warmly. "Good heavens. Child, you're not dressed." "Chancellor," said the king from behind her. "Your Majesty, I mean only, she is plainly distressed. She has been dragged from her bed, and I would remind the hall that this young woman has been under my family's protection since she was 10 years old." Halvard's voice was the kindest thing in the room. "Whatever this proceeding requires of her, it does not require humiliating her at 1 a.m. in a work apron. Let her rest. Let her be given decent clothes and a physician and a day. We can reconvene." Around the table, men who had lost 28 points on the day nodded. It was an entirely reasonable request. It was so reasonable that June, standing in the doorway with her boots in her hand, nearly said yes. "I'd rather not," she heard herself say. The hall went quiet. "Miss Hale," said Halvard, "you don't know what you're refusing." "No," June agreed. "But you've been in this house all night, my lord. And I've been in it for 4 minutes, and you're the one asking for a day." Somebody at the middle of the table laughed, a single shocked bark, quickly smothered. June did not look to see who. She was too busy discovering that her hands had gone cold, and her heart was going like a bird's, and that under all of it, somewhere low and unfamiliar, was a thing she had not felt since she was 10 years old, and had not had a name for since: the specific, dangerous pleasure of being addressed. The king put the hall over until noon, and took her to the archive himself, which she later learned was not a thing kings did. "You should understand my position," Ivor Kestrel said, walking. He walked fast. "Because you are going to be told repeatedly, and by people far more charming than I am, that I have brought you here to rescue you. I have not. I have brought you here because you are a legal instrument, and I intend to use you. That's honest. It's efficient. You'll get honest later if we live that long." He turned a corner into a colder corridor. "The Concord of Assay binds me too. That is the thing nobody outside this building ever believes. I am assayed. My classification is entered on the same registry as a dockhand's. And the Concord provides that a reigning alpha king who has not contracted by his 32nd year shall be matched by the Chancery of Assay, from a list the Chancery composes, at an assay of the crown convened for that purpose." June stopped walking. "The mating ball. That is what the broadsheets call it, yes. Because it is easier to sell a picture of dancing than a picture of a man being valued." He did not stop, so she had to run 3 steps to catch him. "I am 31. In 4 months the Chancery names my consort, and whichever house holds that contract holds the crown's credit, and Halvard Breakwell has had a candidate prepared since I was 24. I have spent 7 years trying to dissolve the Concord. I have tried the courts, the ninefold, and one genuinely stupid attempt at simply refusing, which cost me a province. And you can't." "I cannot," he said, "because the Concord is not a royal law. It is a treaty, and a treaty cannot be dissolved by one party alone." He stopped at a door. "Miss Hale, who do you think the other party is?" The Royal Archive smelled of vellum and cold iron, and faintly, of vinegar. The woman in the gray academic hood was already there. She had come ahead by some back stair, and she had 4 objects laid out on a felt-top table under a hooded lamp. "Cela Andre," she said. "Archivist. I've been waiting to meet you for 4 years, and I'm going to be blunt, because it's nearly 2 a.m. Do you know what your mother did?" "She watched wolves," June said. "She kept journals. She kept these. Andre turned the first object toward her, a small, water-stained field book, quarter-bound in green. The handwriting inside was minute and slanted, and June's throat closed at the sight of it. Noreen of the Grey March. 14 years of continuous observation of the free packs north of the border, which is, as far as anyone knows, the longest field record of unmanaged wolves in existence, and which contains the single most inconvenient sentence ever written in this kingdom. She opened to a marked page and turned it. June leaned in, her mother's hand, faded brown, 3rd winter. I have now watched 11 free packs, and I record with confidence what I have suspected since the 2nd year. There is no alpha. The word describes nothing that occurs here. What I find is a breeding pair, and their offspring of 2 or 3 seasons, a family, and the young defer to the parents exactly as long as they are young, and then they leave and become parents themselves. There is no contest for rank because there is no rank to contest. I have seen the behavior the Chancery calls dominance. I have seen it exactly once, at Marrow Hill, in the enclosure where the assay keeps its study animals. 9 unrelated adults penned together with no possibility of dispersal. There they fight for precedence constantly and viciously, and the strongest eats first, and the observers write it down as nature. It is not nature. It is what nature does in a cage. We have measured the behavior of prisoners, and called it the law of the species. June read it 3 times. That's the whole thing, Andre said quietly. The Concord of Assay classifies 9 ranks of wolf as a natural order. Its entire scientific foundation is the Marrow Hill enclosure study. Your mother, who was the only person alive with 14 years of wild data, told them that the Marrow Hill animals were behaving like inmates. Then how did the law pass? Because they made her a warden instead, said the king. He was standing by the door with his arms folded, and he looked, June thought, extremely tired. 31 years ago, my father's council wanted the Concord, and the banking houses wanted the Concord, and the only obstacle was a woman from the Grey March with a green notebook. So they did not silence her. They hired her. They created the office of Warden of the Wild Registry, and gave it to Noreen, and they invited the free packs of the Grey March to accede to the Concord as a sovereign party. A treaty, you see, between the classified kingdom and the unclassified country, and Noreen signed the instrument of accession as their warden and witness. Page 4. She agreed to it? June's voice cracked. She wrote that. She stabbed a finger at the journal. And then she signed? She signed something, Andre said. We have the ratified Concord, pages 1 to 3 and pages 5 to 12, all original, all in the Chancery vault. Page 4 exists only as a certified transcript made by the Chancery in the year of ratification. The original has never been produced, not once in 31 years. Every time the archive has requisitioned it, we've been told it's under conservation. June looked from one of them to the other. You think the transcript's a lie? I think, said Ivor Kestrel, that a woman who wrote it is what nature does in a cage did not sign a blank surrender. And I think she wrote something into that page that somebody has spent 3 decades keeping out of daylight. And I think 11 years ago she was about to say so. He unfolded his arms. The warden's office is not hereditary in the ordinary sense. It passes to blood, which means that since the winter you were 10 years old, Miss Hale, the party of the second part to the founding treaty of this kingdom, has been a girl scrubbing pots in a house on Coldwater Row. They gave her a room with a fire in it, and a bed she did not get into. Winifred Breakwell knocked at 3:30. She was still in her traveling coat, and she had been crying, in the tidy, furious way of someone who has practiced not being heard through walls. She stood in the doorway with her hands jammed in her pockets. I knew about the letter, she said. June said nothing. Pris showed me at 4 o'clock. She said we'd say it never came. I said we should give it to Mother, and she said Mother would only burn it herself and be sick about it. So we'd be doing her a kindness. Winifred's chin was shaking. I went upstairs and shut my door and did my French. That's what I did. I did my French for 5 hours while it sat on the mantel. Why are you telling me this? Because they'll ask me under oath tomorrow, and I've decided I'm not going to be the sort of person who has to think about it first. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, roughly. I'm not doing it for you. I've been horrid to you for 6 years, and I'm not going to pretend that's undone by one honest night. I saw the exchange from the trap window, all those men running about, and I thought, whatever this is, it's bigger than Pris's spite, and my uncle knew about it, and he let us think it was about a ball. She looked up. June, nobody in that house has ever once explained why you drink that tea. It was Andre who found it, an hour before dawn, because June could not sleep, and had gone back down to the archive, and had asked the only question she had. Why does my certificate say withheld? Andre had frowned at that. It shouldn't. Withheld isn't a result. Null Presentation is a result. It's rare, it's miserable, but it's a finding, and a finding is closed. Withheld is a hold. It's the status they give a file that isn't finished. Hey, mine's been that way for 5 years. The archivist went very still. Then she went up a ladder. The registry's administrative returns were bound by year in black buckram, and Andre took down 11 of them and laid them along the felt table and opened each to the schedule of held files, and June watched a woman's face change 11 times. Juniper Hale, Andre said. Coldwater Row. Status withheld. Renewed annually on the 12th of November. Renewal fee, 4 crowns and 6. Paid. Paid by whom? That's the column I'm looking at. Andre put her finger on it and did not move it. It's not your stepmother. It's not the Chancellor. It's not the crown. She turned the ledger around so June could read it herself, and the lamp made a hard yellow oval on the page, and inside the oval, 11 times over, in 11 different clerks' hands, was the same line of account, drawn on the estate of N. Hale in trust. June had spent 11 years being told there was no money, that the debts had eaten it, that she owed the roof over her head. She had darned the same 3 pairs of stockings since she was 15 because there was no money. There's an estate, she said. There is an estate, said Andre. And every November for 11 years it has quietly paid the Chancery of Assay 4 crowns and 6 to keep you from existing. Behind them, in the archive doorway, somebody said, Ah. Halvard Breakwell stood there with a candle and a dressing gown over his court clothes, entirely calm, as though he had come down for a book. You've found the trust, he said. Good. I did wonder how long. Juniper. Before anyone tells you what that ledger means, I would very much like 10 minutes to tell you why your mother asked me to set it up. Halvard Breakwell took his 10 minutes, and they were, June admitted afterward, extremely good ones. He sat down across the felt table and put his candle between them, and told her that her mother had been brilliant, and had also, in the last 2 years of her life, become frightened in a way that was not entirely reasonable. That Noreen had come to him in the autumn before she died, and asked, begged, he said, and let the word sit, that the child be kept off the registry. That an unclassified girl was invisible, and invisible was safe, and that he had thought it madness, but had loved his sister-in-law's friend enough to do it, that he had set up the trust himself, so the renewals would never lapse and never be traceable to him, because Noreen had been convinced that anyone acting openly on her behalf would be marked. And the debts? June asked. The house? I've been told for 11 years there's nothing. There's nothing available, Halvard said, which is a different thing. And Cordelia is not a liar. The trust is restricted to the single purpose. I could not have released a penny of it for stockings, Juniper, even had I wished to. He smiled, tired and rueful. I have spent 11 years being the man who kept a girl scrubbing floors in order to keep her alive, and I have never once been able to explain it. You may believe that or not. It was the or not that undid the whole performance for her, though it took her most of the following day to work out why. A liar wants to be believed. Halvard Breakwell wanted to be understood, which is a thing you can offer someone whether or not the underlying account is true, and which is much harder to argue with. At noon, the assay of the crown reconvened, and the king, before 40 exhausted men, moved for production of the original 4th page of the Concord of Assay from the Chancery vault. Halvard did not object. That was the first thing that frightened her. He rose and said that the Chancery would produce the instrument with pleasure, that conservation work of that delicacy could not be rushed, and that he would ask the hall for 9 days. 9 days was granted. Consort bonds closed at 58. Cordelia came to her room on the second evening with the chipped blue cup. She had brought it from Coldwater Row. That was the detail June kept returning to later. That in the 9 minutes given to a woman being taken into the king's convenience at midnight, Cordelia Breakwell had gone into her own kitchen and wrapped a cup and a tin in a cloth. "You haven't had it in 2 days," she said from the doorway. "You'll sleep badly. You always do." June looked at the cup for a long moment. "Sit down," she said. Cordelia sat. She set the cup on the table between them, and neither of them touched it, and after a while June said, "The night my mother died, where were you?" "June, you were in the house." June had not known this until she said it. It arrived the way the hearthstone had arrived, out of a floor she had walked over 10,000 times. "There was a woman who brought up the trays. I remember a gray sleeve. I was 10, and I remember a gray sleeve on the stairs, and I have never once in 11 years asked myself whose it was, because you don't ask about the furniture." Cordelia Breakwell put both hands flat on the table, the way a person does when the alternative is letting them shake. "I was her friend," she said. "You married my father 14 months later." "Yes. Why?" "Because Halvard told me that if I did not, the girl would be sent to the Ninefold Sisters at Marrow Hill, and I would never be permitted to see her again." Cordelia's voice did not rise. It went flatter and flatter, the way voices do when they have said a thing internally so many times that saying it aloud is nearly a relief. "And because he told me my own daughters would be assayed by his office in 6 years' time, and that a classification is a finding of fact, and findings of fact are written by clerks. Priscilla is entered as second-class Omega. Winifred is third. Those are not what they are. Those are what he gave me." "For what?" "For the tea." The room was very quiet. Somewhere below in the courtyard, a horse went by on the cobbles. "Noreen was ill for 6 weeks, Cordelia said. "Not fever. She was strong as a gatepost, and then she wasn't, and I sat up with her, and on the 4th week she stopped smelling like herself. I noticed it before she did, and she took hold of my wrist and she said, 'Cordelia, they are unmaking me. They will do it to her next, and it will look like nothing at all.' Her mouth twisted. And she was right, and I did it. Every night for 11 years I brought it up those stairs myself because I could not bear to have a servant do it. I told myself that as long as you smelled of nothing, you were worth nothing, and as long as you were worth nothing, you would be allowed to grow up. And I have been telling myself that so long, June, that I no longer know whether it was ever true, or whether it was simply the shape my cowardice happened to take." June looked at the cup. Chamomile and something bitter under it. 11 years of it. 4,000 nights. "Get out," she said. Cordelia got up. At the door she stopped and did not turn around and said, "It's aconite in a silver base, 2 drops. He gets it from the veterinary stores at Marrow Hill. They use it on the study animals, so the pens don't riot." Physician Maeve Corrigan confirmed it in 90 minutes and was ill-tempered about it for the rest of the week. "Aconitine and colloidal silver," she said, "in a chamomile carrier, and whoever compounded it knew precisely what they were doing, because at 2 drops nightly, it does nothing at all except sit in the scent glands and shut them. It's not poison. That's what makes me want to break something. Poison would have been noticed. This is a stopper in a bottle." She scraped her chair back. Miss Hale, you have been chemically silenced since you were 10 years old. I am obliged to tell you that the reversal will be unpleasant, and I am not able to tell you what it will reverse into, because nobody has ever documented 11 years of continuous suppression in a living subject. There is no literature. There are only the animals at Marrow Hill, and nobody wrote those up honestly. It took 6 days. The first 2 were headaches and a low sick shaking. On the 3rd, June woke in the small hours convinced the room was on fire and found that what she was smelling was the beeswax in the floor. That she had simply never smelled it. That she had spent her life in a world with one sense pinned shut and had assumed the flatness was ordinary. On the 4th, she wept for 2 hours over a bowl of onions and could not explain it to anybody. On the 5th, she walked into the long hall, and 40 men turned around. She had known, distantly, that scent was how wolves read each other. She had not known it was loud. On the 6th day, Maeve Corrigan ran the assay. She ran it properly, with a Chancery observer present and Andre recording, treated linen and the 9 reference strips laid out in their case like surgical instruments. She held the strip to June's throat and waited the prescribed 40 seconds and took it away, and looked at it, and said nothing. She did it again. She sent for a second case of references, because she suspected the first of being degraded. She did it a 3rd time. "Well," she said at last, "that's the twist in the tale, isn't it?" "What is it?" June said. "What am I?" "You're nothing." Corrigan held up the strip. "Null Presentation. Same finding as 5 years ago, Miss Hale, and this time you are producing scent so strongly that I've had to open a window. Do you understand what I'm telling you? It isn't that you have no scent. It's that the instrument cannot read it." Sela Andre stood up so fast her chair went over. "Say that again," she said. "Say it exactly again." "The reference strips don't respond. Any of them. It's like..." Corrigan searched. "It's like being handed a color that isn't on the wheel. Where did the 9 reference standards come from?" Andre's voice had gone strange. "Doctor, where did the standards come from?" Corrigan opened her mouth, closed it. "Marrow Hill," she said. The archive was silent. "The 9 classifications of the Concord of Assay," Andre said slowly, "were derived from 9 captive animals in a pen. Every reference strip in this kingdom is calibrated against 9 unrelated wolves who could not disperse. It has never mattered, because everyone in Hallomere for 3 generations has been born inside the same enclosure and reads on the same scale." She turned. "And then you put a Grey March bloodline in front of it. And the instrument says null, because the instrument was never built to see wild." June sat down on the archive step. "There's no such thing as unclassed," she said. "There is no such thing as classed," said Andre. "That's the finding. Not that you're outside the 9. That the 9 were never a description of wolves. They were a description of a cage, and every soul in this kingdom has spent 31 years being priced against it. And there are 4 million crowns of bond paper on the Thornberry exchange that says nobody is ever allowed to notice." The king found her on the archive step an hour later and sat down on it, which she was beginning to understand was also not a thing kings did. "I owe you honest," he said. "You may have it now, if you want it. Go on." "When Andre brought me your mother's journals 4 years ago, I did not care about your mother. I cared that there was an instrument that might unbuild the Concord and let me out of a marriage the Chancery is going to sell in 4 months. He said it evenly, looking at the opposite wall. "That is what I was, 4 years ago. Then we started pulling the thread and found a warden of the Wild Registry, who died at 34 of a fever nobody else in the house caught, and a daughter whose file had been on hold for a decade, and I stopped being able to tell myself it was about my own convenience, which was, frankly, inconvenient. You could have come for me at any time. I could have come for you at 18 and got you killed at 18. He turned his head. "Miss Hale, The day you become useful is the day you become worth removing. The only protection I could give you was the writ, in open court, on the roll, with the whole exchange watching. Because a girl who dies quietly on Coldwater Row is a sad story, and a girl who dies 9 days before she is due to testify is a confession. I waited 4 years to make you too public to kill. And then your stepsister put the thing in a fire, and for 3 hours I thought I had killed you by being clever. June found she had nothing to say to that. Also, he added, you smell like the gray March in November, and it is extremely distracting, and I want it on the record that I have not mentioned it until now. That's the honest part? That's the honest part. Winifred came on the 8th night, at 2 a.m, with her boots in her hand and her coat over her nightdress and a cedar box under her arm. She had gone back to Coldwater Row. She had taken a hired gig with her own quarter's allowance, alone, at 10 o'clock at night, and let herself in with the scullery key and gone up to her uncle's room, because Halvard kept a room there, had kept one for 11 years, and taken the box out from under his traveling trunk. There's no lock on it, she said, breathing hard. I looked. There's no keyhole. I couldn't get it open, and I nearly didn't bring it, because what use is a box you can't? June took it, and it opened in her hands. There was no mechanism to see. Later, Andre would find the mortised channel and the scent-set resin, and would write a paper about it that nobody would publish for 2 years. In the moment, it simply came open along a seam, June's fingers found without looking, the way you find a light switch in your own house, and underneath the lid were 3 interlocking rings and a bar, blind stamped in the cedar. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a single sheet of heavy ratification vellum, foxed at the edges, numbered IV in the upper corner, and signed at the foot in a minute slanted hand June would have known anywhere. Andre made a sound like she had been struck, because the certified transcript in the Chancery vault, the one every law student in Hallomere had read, the one that had underwritten 31 years of bond issues, recorded page 4 as an unconditional accession by the free packs of the Grey March to the Concord of Assay, in perpetuity. The original said something else. It said that the free packs of the Grey March had never been asked, could not be asked, and did not consent, that the undersigned Warden signed only as witness to the fact of their absence, and that the Concord might stand as a domestic law of Hallomere for so long as it was honestly described as one, a rule the kingdom had made for itself out of a study of 9 caged animals, and that the accession of the wild had been offered and declined. And in the last line, in a hand that had begun to press harder, the Warden, or her blood, may attend any assay of the crown, and there declare the declination in open hall, upon which this instrument fails, being founded upon a consent that was never given. It fails, Andre whispered. Not amends. Fails. The whole Concord is void from the root. 31 years of classifications, settlements, every consort bond ever issued. He didn't destroy it, June said. She could hear her own voice from a long way off. Why didn't he destroy it? Because he couldn't open the box, said Winifred. June looked down. The lid had come apart to her hands, and to no one else's in 11 years, and something in her chest turned over very slowly and hurt. Then she took out the second document. It was smaller. It was printed, with blanks filled in by a clerk, and it bore the seal of the parish registrar of Thornberry Reach, and it was dated the 19th of February in the year June had turned 10, 4 days after her mother's funeral. Certificate of death. Juniper Noreen Hale, aged 10 years, of Coldwater Row. Cause, contagious fever, interred with the mother. Winifred made a small noise. June set it down on the felt very carefully, as though it might go off. I've been dead for 11 years, she said. Then you cannot testify, said Sela Andre. And for the first time since June had met her, the archivist sounded afraid. June. A dead woman has no standing. Halvard doesn't have to disprove a word you say. In 4 days, he only has to stand up in that hall and produce a parish record, and every syllable out of your mouth becomes an impersonation. And impersonating a registered decedent to interfere with a crown instrument is a hanging matter. Down in the courtyard, a clock began to strike 2. He's not going to fight the evidence at all, June said. He's going to say I don't exist, and he's been saying it since I was 10. On the 9th morning, the long hall was so full, they took the doors off their hinges. They had to. There were 200 people in a room built for 40, and another 600 in the courtyard, and the exchange had suspended trading in consort bonds at 9 o'clock because there was no longer any honest price to put on them. The clerks of the Chancery of Assay sat in 3 rows behind their Chancellor, with 19 boxes of ledgers stacked at their feet. The ninefold sent 4 bishops. Somebody had put a chair in the middle of the floor for the witness, and nobody had thought to put a table beside it, so June sat down at 10 o'clock in a borrowed gray dress with her hands empty in her lap and her mother's cedar box on the boards at her feet. Ivor Kestrel took the seat at the head of the table and did not sit in it as a king. That was the whole architecture of the thing, and she had not understood it until she saw it. An assay of the crown was a proceeding in which the sovereign was a party. He could not rule. He could only be weighed like everybody else by the instrument. "Chancellor," he said, "produce page 4. Halvard Breakwell rose. "With regret, Your Majesty, the Chancery cannot." The hall made a noise like a wave going out. "The original instrument of accession has been missing from the vault since before my tenure," Halvard said, over it, unhurried. "I have suspected as much for 9 years and I have been unable to prove it, and I will submit the vault's requisition log to this hall for the entire 31 years and let it speak. What the Chancery can produce is the certified transcript, which has been the operative text of this kingdom since ratification, and which I ask the hall to accept unless and until a party brings the original before it." He turned then, for the first time, to look at June. "I am told a party intends to." "She does," said June. "Then, before she opens her mouth," said Halvard Breakwell gently, "the Chancery Objects to her standing, and I ask the hall's clerk to read the record I have lodged this morning." The clerk read it. It took 11 seconds. "Certificate of death, Juniper Hale, aged 10 years, contagious fever, interred with the mother, parish of Thornberry Reach." The noise in the hall was different this time, uglier. "I make no accusation against this young woman," Halvard said, and he sounded, God help her, sad. "I think it very likely she believes what she has been told. But the hall must understand what is being attempted, a bloodline claim to the founding treaty of this kingdom, brought by a person with no parish record, no registry classification, no cent presentation, and a death certificate. If this hall accepts that, it accepts that any woman off any road may walk in here and unmake the law of Hallomere by saying so. I would be failing in my office if I did not say it plainly." A pause, perfectly weighted. "Whose daughter she is a matter for pity. Whether she is anybody at all is a matter for evidence." He sat down, and June, who had been rehearsing a speech for 4 days, discovered that she was not going to give it. "Chancellor," she said, "how much is 4 crowns and 6? It came apart slowly, which was the terrible and beautiful thing about it. Not a blow. An unpicking. "I'm asking," June said, "because I've been doing sums. I've never had money, so I'm careful with sums." She kept her hands still in her lap. 4 crowns and 6 a year for 11 years is 49 crowns and 6pence. Paid every 12th of November to the Chancery of Assay, out of a trust drawn on the estate of Noreen Hale, to renew the withheld status on the registry file of Juniper Hale of Coldwater Row. That is a matter I have already explained to you privately." "Yes. You told me my mother asked you to hide me." June looked up. "My lord, I don't want to argue about that. I want to ask the clerks of the Chancery of Assay, a question about their own procedure, because they'll know it better than either of us. She turned in the chair. When a person on the registry dies, does the file stay open? No. The 3 rows of clerks looked at one another. No, miss, said a young man in the second row, before anyone senior could stop him. It's closed on the parish return, struck through and filed to the dead rolls. Is there a fee? There's no fee to close, miss. There's nothing to renew. It's closed. So, a withheld file, June said, is a file the Chancery believes belongs to a living person. Yes, necessarily. You can't hold a dead file. There's nothing to hold. June turned back. You certified me dead in February, she said, and you paid to keep my file open in November. And then again the next November, and the next 11 times, in your own procedure, with your own hand on the trust. 4 crowns and 6 each time. My lord, you have been paying an annual fee for 11 years to keep alive the file of a girl you say is in a grave. She let it sit. Either the parish record is false, or the Chancery of Assay has been billing a trust for a service it knew was impossible. I don't mind which. Both of them mean I'm sitting here. Halvard Breakwell did not move. Behind him, in the second row, the young clerk had gone the color of paper, because he had just worked out that he was the one who had written the ledger line for the 11th of them. After that, they called the witnesses, and it took 6 hours, and it was almost entirely paper. Physician Maeve Corrigan gave the assay results and the reference standard failure, then produced her notes, the sample from the chipped blue cup, and the veterinary requisition slips from the study enclosure at Marrow Hill, which bore, in the requisitioning column, a Chancery account number rather than a name, and which the Chancery's own clerks identified in under a minute once the number was read out, because clerks are loyal to their systems long after they stop being loyal to their masters. I'll say the rest without being asked, Corrigan told the hall, because I'll not have it said afterward that nobody would. There is aconitine in this woman's tissue today. There is 11 years of it. You cannot get 11 years of a compound into a body that has been under a stone since February of that year. The parish record isn't merely wrong. It is chemically impossible. Sela Andre gave the archive's requisition log. 51 applications for the original page 4 across 31 years, and 51 refusals, and 19 of them signed by Halvard Breakwell. Cordelia Breakwell was called at 4 and gave her evidence standing, because she refused the chair. She did not soften anything. She did not weep. She said that she had nursed Noreen Hale for 6 weeks and had watched her scent go out of her like a lamp, that she had married Tobias Hale under a threat to her children's classifications, that she had administered 2 drops of aconite tincture nightly to her stepdaughter for 11 years, knowing exactly what it was, and that she had done it because it was the only way she had been able to imagine of keeping the girl alive, and because she had been afraid, and because after the 4th or 5th year, the fear had become a habit, and the habit had become a life. I am not asking this hall for anything, she said. I want the record to be complete. I have heard what my brother-in-law will say, that he protected her. He did not protect her. He stored her. There is a difference, and I know it exactly, because I was the shelf. Priscilla Breakwell was called at 5, and was, in the end, the ugliest and most useful witness of the day, because she was too proud to lie badly. Asked whether she had destroyed a crown writ, she said yes. Asked why, she said, because it had her name on it, and not mine. Asked whether she had been instructed by anyone, she said no. And then, when counsel moved on, she said, unprompted, in a voice that shook with something that was not remorse, but was at least honesty. Nobody had to instruct me. That's what I'd like the hall to write down. My uncle spent 6 years telling me at every dinner table that I was a second-class Omega worth 1,100 crowns, and that June was worth nothing, and then he acted surprised when I behaved like it. I have been a very nasty girl. I would like the record to show that I was also an extremely well-trained one. And Winifred Breakwell, 17, in her school coat, told the hall in a small, clear voice about the mantle, and the 5 hours of French, and the hired gig at 10 at night, and her uncle's traveling trunk, and produced the Cedar Box. They passed it around the table. It went to 11 people. 4 bishops of the ninefold, 3 factors of the great bond houses, the king, the archivist, a clerk, and finally the Chancellor of the Assay, who held it in both hands with an expression June never afterward managed to describe, and who could not open it either. Then they gave it back to her, and it opened, and the hall was so quiet she could hear the vellum move. She read page 4 aloud in her mother's words, and then she said the sentence that ended the Concord of Assay, and it was 17 words long. I attend as the Warden's blood, and I declare the declination of the free packs of the Grey March. And Halvard Breakwell stood up and said, "The hall cannot possibly verify that." It was, June understood later, the only honest thing he said all day, because he was right. A signature can be forged. A box can be a trick of joinery. There was no instrument in Hallomere that could tell this room whether the Wild had ever declined anything. And there never had been, and that was precisely why the transcript had held for 31 years. "No," June agreed. "You'd have to ask them." She got up out of the chair and walked, past 200 people, out through the doorless doorway into the courtyard, and the courtyard emptied after her, and the hall emptied after the courtyard, and she went up the long slope of frozen grass to the north wall, where the parkland ran out into the trees. And it was 10 minutes past 6 and full dark, and the cold came down off the Grey March smelling of ice and pine. She stood at the wall and she sang the threshold song. It had no words. It went low, then lower, then climbed in that odd interval that felt wrong on a human throat, and it ended unresolved, hanging, the way it always had over the stockpot and the laundry coppers and the cold larder in February. She sang it badly the first time, because her voice was shaking. She sang it again. Nothing happened for 11 seconds. June counted them. Then, from somewhere beyond the tree line, out of the dark of a country that had never been counted, a voice answered, and then a second, in a different register, and a third. And then the whole north went up in a long braided noise that rolled down over the wall and over 800 silent people standing in a courtyard in their court clothes. And Cela Andre, who had spent 19 years in an archive, sat down on the frozen grass and put her hands over her face. It was not proof. June knew that. It would not have satisfied a court of law anywhere. It satisfied everyone who heard it. Because every soul on that hillside had been taught since infancy that the Wild was a lesser and more brutal version of themselves, 9 ranks with the teeth still in, and what came down off the Grey March that night was a family calling to a member of it, and there was nothing in it that sounded like a hierarchy at all. When June turned around, Ivor Kestrel was 3 feet behind her. "Your Majesty," she said. "I have to go back in there and lose my kingdom's entire credit market," he said. "I wanted 30 seconds first." "For what?" "To say that whatever happens in the next hour, I want it on the record with you and not with them. I would have brought you here anyway, even if page 4 had said what the transcript said, even if the box had never opened." He was not touching her. He had been careful about that for 9 days, and she had noticed, and she had known precisely what it cost him because she could smell it. "I'd have brought you here and lost, and I would have counted it a good use of a reign." That's very grand. It's very true. I find they're occasionally the same thing. He glanced back down the hill at the lights. "Come on, let's go and be responsible for something enormous." The Concord of Assay failed at 9 minutes past 8 that evening, not repealed. Failed. Void from the root, as Andre had said, being founded upon a consent that was never given. The 9 classifications ceased to exist as legal facts. Every consort bond in the kingdom became a claim on an instrument that had never lawfully existed, which meant that a great many extremely careful men discovered simultaneously that they were holding paper. The next 4 months were the ugliest June had ever lived through, and she spent most of them in a committee room. Because dismantling a cage is only the first half of the work, and the second half is deciding what happens to the people who built their houses against the bars. 60,000 families in Hallomere had their entire savings in consort bonds. Not factors, but schoolmasters and coopers and widows who had been told for 3 decades that this was the safe, patriotic, crown-blessed place to put money. June listened to a shipwright from the Reach explain that his daughter's bonds had been going to keep him when his hands went, and understood that she could be the girl who was owed something, or the person who fixed it, and not both. The Reconstitution Act took her name off it at her own insistence and passed in the spring. It voided the classifications and it voided the bonds, and then it did the part that mattered. It made the Chancery of Assay's own fee income, 31 years of percentages on every issue, held in the Chancery's reserve and in the private estates of its officers. The first and exclusive fund for restitution of small holders. The great houses got nothing. The men who had taken a cut of every human being priced in Hallomere paid the coopers and the widows, and it took 9 years. And it was not enough. And it was the only version of the thing that could be defended out loud. The enclosure at Marrow Hill was opened in April. 6 of the 9 study animals were too old and too institutionalized to disperse, and lived out their lives in a paddock with the fence taken down, which June thought about a great deal. 3 went north and did not come back. Halvard Breakwell was tried in the autumn for falsifying a parish record, interruption of process, and the sustained administration of a noxious compound to a minor. He was not hanged. June testified against that, at some cost to her reputation, on the grounds that a kingdom which had just stopped deciding people's worth by decree should be slow to start again. He got 22 years. He never once said he was sorry, and June came to believe it was because he did not think he had done anything except administer a system everybody had agreed to. Cordelia Breakwell went to Marrow Hill herself, as a matron in the reopened parish infirmary, and wrote to June 4 times a year. June answered 2 of the 4. She could not have told anyone why those 2. Priscilla went to the Grey March, of all places, in the 2nd year, and by the 4th was running a survey station and writing letters home that were rude about everybody. Winifred read law. A year and a day after the long haul, the first assembly of the Grey March met in a barn at Coldwater Row, because June had insisted the first one be held on the wrong side of the border, in a building with a dirt floor, so that nobody could mistake it for a court. Ivor came as a guest, was seated 4th from the end, and enjoyed it enormously. Afterward, when the barn had emptied, he found her in the scullery of the old house, where somebody had lit the kitchen fire, and she was standing before it, with a small brown bottle in her hand. "The last of it," she said. "Corrigan kept one for the evidence, and I asked for it back. Are you going to burn it?" "No. Glass doesn't burn, it just goes ugly." She turned it over. "I was going to pour it out, but I've been standing here 11 minutes because there's a part of me that keeps thinking, what if I need it? What if it comes back? What if there's a room I have to walk into someday where it's safer to be nothing?" She looked up at him with a crooked, exhausted mouth. 11 years, and they got the fear all the way in. That's the part nobody puts in the act. Ivor Kestrel leaned against the doorframe. "May I say a thing badly?" "You usually do." "I am no longer required by law to contract a match. There is no chancery to name anyone, no ball, no list, no instrument that can put a number on either of us." He said it carefully, and she understood he had written it down somewhere and thrown the paper away. "Which means that if I asked you now, there is nothing whatsoever behind the asking. No pressure of office, no settlement, no consequence to you for saying no. This year, or any year, and I have written to the Assembly to say so in terms, so that you never have to wonder whether I've made your no expensive." That's the least romantic proposal ever delivered in a scullery. It's not a proposal. It's the clearing of the ground before one. I'd rather not stand on somebody else's floor. A pause. I intend to ask. Not tonight. June looked at the fire. Ask me next year, she said. In this room, and I'll answer for myself, out loud, with nobody's hand on the cup. Next year, he agreed. And then she poured the bottle out into the ashes, and the fire hissed and spat and did not like it, and she stood and watched it go until it was gone, because there was one thing she had learned in a scullery on Coldwater Row and had never once been able to unlearn. And it was that the burning is never the point. The watching is. Somebody always makes you watch. She had spent 11 years being shown things she was not permitted to want by people who needed her to watch them go. It had taken a year of committee rooms and one long braided howl off the gray march to understand that the whole machinery, the treated linen, the 9 ranks, the 4 million crowns of paper, the chipped blue cup carried upstairs 4,000 nights by a frightened woman who called it kindness, had never been about what she was. It had been about who got to say. Her mother had written it in a green notebook in her 3rd winter in the wild, and it had cost her her life. And it was still, June thought, the only sentence in Hallomere worth learning by heart. We have measured the behavior of prisoners and called it the law of the species. Outside, past the beet fields, past the wall, the north was quiet. Somewhere up there was a country nobody had ever successfully counted, where a family is only a family, and the young defer to the old exactly as long as they are young, and then they walk out into the cold and become somebody's parents, and no clerk in a gray coat ever writes down what they are worth. June banked the fire and put out the lamp. If a thing has to be certified before it counts as real, she thought, going up the stairs of the house on Coldwater Row for the last time, then tell me, who is holding the stamp, and what do they lose the day you stop asking for it?